Welcome to our first video about radicals. Radicals is the math term for square roots, but it can mean other things as well. We're going to also see things called cubic roots, and those aren't the only two. You can have fourth roots and fifth roots and so on. But for this course, we're going to be looking at square roots and cubic roots. In question 1, we are asked to evaluate the radical. Now, if you remember, there's a rule that says when you're taking the square root of a fraction, it's the same as the square root of the numerator divided by the square root of the denominator. And these are both things that are called perfect squares, things we can do the square root of. The square root of 49 is 7, because 7 squared is 49. And the square root of 36 is 6, because 6 squared is 36. So the square root of 49 over 36 is the same as 7 over 6. In question 2, we are again asked to evaluate the radical. Now you'll notice it says round to the nearest thousandth. So it knows that this is not going to come out to a nice number like the last one did. So we're going to have to put this in our calculator and then do some rounding potentially. So the first challenge is making sure we understand how to do a cubic root in your calculator. It depends on your calculator, but most of the calculators that you're going to be using will have a button that looks like this. Now, many times it's not the button itself, it's the thing written above the button or the second function of that button. So what you're going to need to do in order to access that is to press the second button and then that. Now, to put this cubic root of negative 54 in your calculator, the button pushing sequence is you're going to put in, if you have this button, you're going to put in 3 and then second, that's a button that you're going to push. And then you're going to look for that X root Y button. And then you're going to type in negative 54. Now remember, negative and minus are two different buttons. Usually the negative is going to have a set of parentheses around it. So those are the buttons that you should be pushing. If you've pushed those buttons correctly, your calculator is going to spit out a decimal. And it's negative, which we would assume because anytime you do the cubic root of a negative number, it's going to end up being negative. Now we've been asked to round to the nearest thousandth. So let's talk about where that is. The first number after a decimal point is the tenths spot. The second one is the hundredths. The third spot is the thousandth. Now, if it asks us to go further, the next one would be the 10,000th. And then we have the 100,000th. So we are looking to round to the nearest thousands, which means 3 decimal places. So we need to know about this guy. So we need to know, does the 9 stay the same or go up? Well, you always just look at the number after. The number after here is 5 or more. That means my 9's going up. Now 9's tricky to go up because after 9 comes 10. But instead of looking at just that 9, think about it as 79. If 79 was going to go up, it would go up to 80. So the rounded version would look like that. Because the 9 has to go up to a 0 basically, but it's going to bump this guy up too. Or you can think about it as 79 being rounded up to 80. You'll notice in number 3 our directions have changed. It says simplify the radical. That means we're not rounding, we want exact answers, but in the simplest form. So we're going to use another rule of exponents, that if you have the square root of AB, that's the same as the square root of A times the square root of B. So we're going to use that to simplify this radical. I'm going to rewrite this 500 x to the 5th as a bunch of things being multiplied together, like the a and the b in the rule. Now I'm going to choose carefully. I want things that multiply to 500, but one of them needs to be a perfect square, something we can do the square root of. And I want to try and find the biggest thing that's going to help us that we can do the square root of. So I think the biggest thing we can do the square root of that will work here is 100, because I can do the square root of 100, times 5. 100 times 5 is 500, so this is going to work for us. When it comes to variables, when we're doing square roots, we need variables that are squared. Now I've got x to the 5th. I need him in groups of 2 or groups of x squareds. So there's 2 x's, right? X times x. Here's another 2. That gets me up to 4 total. I have 5 in the original problem, so I need 1 more. This is still x to the 5th, and this is still 500. Now the shorthand way of doing the next step is let's go ahead and do the square roots that we can do. So the square root of 100 is 10. Now that 10 is just a regular old 10. He's not under the root anymore. The square root of 5 is going to be a decimal, so I'm going to leave him underneath. The square root of x squared is x both times. But the square root of a regular old x, I have to leave underneath. We can't do that. So coming out of the radical are all of these things right here that we actually got to do. So that would be a 10, and x times x, or x squared. And underneath the radical, I'm keeping the 5 because it would give me a decimal, and I don't want that, and the x by itself. This is the simplified version of our original radical. Let's do one more. Now this one, we're simplifying the radical, so no decimals or anything. This one is a cubic root. Now cubic root, the process is exactly the same as the square root, but we're looking for perfect cubes. So it's a different list of numbers we're looking for, but the process is the same. So let's start here with that negative 54. I want 2 things that multiply to 54, one of which is a perfect cubed number, and I think that's going to be 27. I think it's 27 times 2 will get us to that 54. Now whenever you have a negative under the cubed root, we're going to keep that negative with whatever's coming out. So the 27 is coming out, so we're going to keep the negative with the 27, and 27 times 2 would get me back to 54. Remember, we can do cubic root of negative things, but you can't do square roots of negative things, so that's why that's okay. Next, let's look at some variables. I have x to the 3rd power. Now when we were doing square roots, we wanted x squareds, but when you're doing cubic root, we want x cubed, so I'm going to leave that guy alone. Now let's talk about these y's. There's 5 of them sitting there. I want them in groups of 3. So I've got one group of 3, and to get to 5, I'm going to have 2 more sitting in there. All right, let's do what we can and leave underneath anything that's going to be messy. The cubic root of negative 27 is negative 3. The 2 would be messy, so we're going to leave him. The cubic root of x cubed is x. The cubic root of y cubed is y. But y squared is not a group of 3, so he's going to stay underneath. All right, so outside of the radical, we moved out a negative 3, a regular negative 3, a regular x, and a regular y. Staying underneath the radical is a 2 and a y squared. Now don't make this mistake. This answer is not done yet. It's not complete because this was not a square root. It was a cubic root. So don't lose him. That is the simplified version of that cubic root.